Well, it's been a cold old season so far, but my goodness, that hasn't stopped the plants doing their thing. That's where we gardeners really score, you know. I mean, just look at this daisy bush. This is Olearia sciloniensis, and it's been in flower like that from the beginning of April and still more to come. Now, this really is a plant that's used to better things because it was raised at Tresco on the Scilly Isles. Well, I say better things, I mean warmer things, but of course being raised there, it means it's an ideal plant for windy gardens or for seaside gardens. And the astonishing thing is that even if you buy a small plant from the garden centre or take a cutting, that'll be in flower too. It just shows you how wonderful nature is. And later on in the programme, we've got living proof of that, and proof too of the fact that all that stuff that I've been telling you about compost and manure really does work. I certainly wouldn't have been without my compost in this part of the garden. The soil here is really heavy clay and it's quite boggy too. So I decided that this gave me the opportunity to grow moisture and shade-loving plants, and there are quite a lot of those. So the first thing was to plant some trees. First of all, of course, to provide the shade, but also to suck out quite a lot of excess moisture from the soil. And I then worked into the soil some compost, and I regularly mulch over the top with compost now as well. And this enables me to grow plants like the lovely primulas. This one is Primula florindi, and it's one of the more robust types, and it has these lovely yellow flowers for weeks. Really nice, that one. Claytonia, I think, deserves to be more widely grown. For some reason, this is called miner's lettuce, and I'm not sure why. But it has these lovely, delicate little pink and white flowers as well for very many weeks during the season, and it will seed itself quite freely too, though it never becomes invasive. I also have the opportunity now to grow a range of ferns, and I really love these. Things like the lady fern there, which has lovely, delicate foliage. Mind you, they have totally unpronounceable Latin names like Atherium filix femina minutissima. But it's worth trying to get your tongue round those names for ferns like that. I suppose my favourite one is the Japanese painted fern, that's this one, because it has foliage which is really quite unlike any other fern. And it's not that difficult to grow. Now, it does have a reputation for being a little bit tender, but I find that if you cover the crown with leaf mould or with compost during the winter, then it should survive okay. I do have to worry a little bit about frost in this particular area. If you have a look at that camellia there, you can see that some of the leaves there have been damaged by frost, but that'll soon recover from that. And you may remember that a couple of weeks ago I showed you some potatoes that were quite badly hit. But I suggested at the time that they were going to recover, and they're now doing quite well. For me, it's the beginning of the seed collecting season, and generally the alpines come first. But at this time, you need a really eagle eye open all the time, because you want to collect the seeds when the pods are dry and ripe and just before they disperse the seeds themselves. You can see here on this little calceolaria that the seeds in this pod have actually already gone, and I'm hoping to find some seedlings around the plant. But on this pod, they're still there, and this is absolutely perfect. So what you need to do is to very carefully cut off the pod, and I do this with a pair of secateurs, and then to just put them into an envelope, and then you take them inside. Empty the envelope out onto a piece of paper, and if necessary, break the seeds out of the capsules. If there are any bits of seed capsule in with the seeds, I find they can generally be removed with the tip of a knife, and then you can sow the seeds on top of a very gritty compost which has previously been watered. Cover with about 1/4 inch of coarse grit, and then the pots can go out into the cold frame. Leave it there for quite some time, because some of these alpines can take up to a couple of years to germinate. But with flowers like these, it's well worth the wait.
You know, there really are some idyllic little corners of England. And not many, I don't think, more idyllic than little Somerset villages like this one. Yes, if you need to unwind from the pressures of work, it's to places like this that you really ought to come. And of course, not many people need to unwind more than our leading politicians, and especially our party leaders.
I think Eastbourne is now going to be an extremely good result for the party, and it'll be a result which she will not be able to ignore.
The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Paddy Ashdown, celebrates his party's victory in the Eastbourne by-election.
We must, in this decade, build a party capable not just of sharing in the government of our country, but of becoming the government of our country.
Yes, Paddy and Jane Ashdown unwind from their worldly pressures among the flowers, the vegetables and the compost of their cottage garden.
A bit over there.
Oh, you're great at pointing it out, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
You want to do the digging?
No, no, you heave, I'll grunt.
So this really is how a politician relaxes, is it?
Well, I tell you this, I'm not sure about relaxation, but it doesn't half get rid of the frustration. I can think one or two of my colleagues in the House of Commons I wouldn't mind putting on a compost heap now and again.
You recycle one or two of them, would you?
But, no, it's part of the work of the garden, as you know. Very important.
Everything goes on this compost heap, even the bits and pieces out of the Hoover bag.
Yeah, when I dig it up 2 years later, and I found the old crisp packets in there, I don't half get furious. Well, you see it when we bring the muck in, because, of course, we've only got back entrance here. So if I have muck on my garden, it has to be dumped outside the front door, more or less, and then shipped round through my neighbours. Makes the village talk a bit.
You don't have to bring it through the dining room, I hope.
No, we bring it round the back, but through my neighbour's garden. Fortunately, I've got a nice, understanding neighbour, so she allows that to happen.
But it obviously is a real therapy, isn't it?
It's peace, and peace, for me, and I suppose for many others who work a reasonably busy life, is a very valuable commodity. And this is the only place I really get it. Politics is rush and dash and hurry and panic. But you can't panic about something that grows. It grows in its own good time. Brings you down to earth.
Oh, yes.
Talking about growing and problems, Stefan, I have a big problem. Can I show you? It's my plum tree.
Oh, yes. Very silvery leaves. I bet it's a Victoria, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's a dear friend.
Yes, well, it could be a dear friend that's going to be departed soon. It could be silverleaf disease, which I'm afraid is a bit serious. But the way to tell is to cut through a branch. Have you got something I can just chop through that little branch with?
Would secateurs do?
Secateurs would do fine.
I don't know how sharp they are.
No, that's right, they'll do it. We just need to cut through here. Yes, if we look at this... Yes, if we look inside the wood here, we haven't got a brown staining. So
Hooray!
you could be in luck. If there's a brown staining, it means it's definitely silverleaf. If there isn't a brown staining, it could just be a nutrient deficiency. Feed it, like hell.
What?
Oh, a general fertiliser, blood, fish and bone.
Wonderful.
Sulphate of potash early next year. So all could be well. But it's the sort of thing you see in cottage gardens. And this garden's got a lovely cottagey feel. Down here, this is, to me, a typical classic cottage garden border. Oh, I'm delighted to see that not everyone treats foxgloves as weeds and pulls them out.
Oh, no, I let them bide, I'm afraid. Let them grow where they land.
Well, that's the joy of cottage gardening, isn't it? You let nature do some of it for you.
Well, I think so. I mean, I bought these from Devon. We moved from Devon 20 years ago. And I bought a head, a seed head with me, and I just sprinkled it around, and they pop up every year.
A lovely mixture of flowers that you've got here.
Well, some of them come from various places. I must confess that I do pick an awful lot of stuff up at Liberal jumble sales and plant stalls and things.
There's a whole horticultural subculture there as they're going on.
Oh, yes.
The plant exchange.
My hollyhocks come from France. Girlfriend bought the seed head back and managed to germinate all these little plants. But I'm afraid they've got rust. What do you do about rust?
Not a lot. Look, that's hollyhocks. I still think they're worth growing despite the rust, but you can't grow hollyhocks without it. And cotton lavender here.
Ah, yes.
Lovely perfume, also very important in a cottage garden.
Yes, I didn't realise how very, very important it was to people until my father went blind about 8 to 10 years ago. And he couldn't enjoy all the wonders of seeing flowers. And it was very important that when we took him flowers, that he could actually smell them and crush them in his fingers. Particularly the mints and all the other lovely smelling things.
Yes, like eau de cologne and pineapple mint.
And I've got a ginger mint as well. It's a lovely little, with little yellow stripes in the leaves.
I may well go away with a sprig of that.
If I can find one.
And I rather like those irises as well.
Yes, now those irises, they grow like mad. I just don't know how to control them, so I hoik them out every year and pass them round to friends. But I won't throw anything away, you see. Nothing that grows will ever be thrown away. It's always passed on to some unsuspecting neighbour. And they do the same to me.
But you're encroaching a bit. Your border's spreading down towards the bottom of the garden.
Yes, I've stolen a bit of Paddy's veg, I'm afraid. I've put the chrysanthemums and the dahlias in there. I did it while he was away, and he hasn't found out yet.
Ah, man tending his shallots.
Well, they always need a constant load of weeding, don't they?
Do you realise your veg garden is being encroached? You know the flowers are moving in here.
Well, I have to tell you that Jane thinks I haven't noticed this, but I have. I let you into a little secret she won't have told you, and that is she's only re-invading what I took from her in the first place, because it was about 4 or 5 years ago we had quite a little family argument about whether or not I could extend my vegetable patch, and she said no. So when she was out one day, I lifted all the sods, and by the time you came back, I had it dug and planted. So she's quietly taking back, and I don't object. I mean, the truth is, this year, Stefan, she's done more in the vegetable patch, which is usually my terrain, than I've done because it's just been such a hectic year. But when I get a bit more spare time, she doesn't realise it. She'll lose it all again.
What delights me is to see that you are a real gardener, aren't you? You're a real veg grower. You're not just pretending to.
Well, I'm not an expert, if that's what you mean.
No, but you enjoy it.
And the first house we ever had, and we got married when I was 20, first house we ever had, I was out there trying to make things grow in the garden. At that stage it was down in Poole, very stony ground. But everywhere I've been, I've always tried to have a vegetable garden with greater or lesser success. The joy of coming here, more than 20 years ago, was that for the first time I had a decent soil, or a relatively decent soil to work in.
What would you do if you weren't a politician? Would you love to spend your whole time out here?
Well, I put you in these terms. If I could play a musical instrument, if I could play a violin, like classical music, I wouldn't be a politician. But if I couldn't be a politician, and I couldn't play a musical instrument, I'd want to work with my hands somewhere outside. Gardening would be one of the things. Wouldn't mind running a nursery. My father ran a nursery, and I loved to help him to garden there.
So it's in the blood.
It's in the blood, but it's more than that. It really is a sanctuary. The village is a sanctuary. Our life here is a little pool of peace in a very disturbed world. And the truth of it is that one of the things I love here is not just my own house, which we're addicted to. I fell in love with the day I arrived here. I actually bought this house without walking in through the front door. But I love the village, but the people here are terrific. Everywhere else in England, they treat me as Paddy Ashton MP, leader of the Liberal Democrats. Here in the village, I'm Paddy Ashton. I don't inflict my politics on them, and they do me the favour, and I think privilege, of treating me as a villager, and that's good enough for me. I've lived here 20 years, longer than I've been in politics.
And there's some keen gardeners in the village, I know, because I've spoken to them.
Yeah, very keen gardeners. But I tell you what, Stephen, this is not my only thing. I mean, I love my vegetables, but I've got one piece of real pride. I love building dry stone walls. I was taught dry stone walling by an old Devon man in the house we had before we came here, and I built a wall out the front I wanted to take a look at.
I'd love to see.
Let's go.
That's almost bricklaying of Churchillian proportions.
Well, I wouldn't claim that. It's my pride and joy, and it's turned out better than I'd first imagined. When I first came here, Stefan, there was a fence all the way down here, iron fence, iron gate, and all this was down as paving stones there. Frankly, at that time, every time I walked out the front door, I felt I ought to be whistling the Prisoner's Chorus from Fidelio.
A sterile garden.
Absolutely awful. I have a real feel for stone. If I see them lying around in a pile, I know just the stone that's going to have to go in the next place. And I built lots of stone walls, but this one's turned out best. We planted it. As you can see, the campanular's taken over, but it's a lovely colour.
Well, when you've got the framework, you can paint it with colours, can't you?
Absolutely.
But you've used this iron railing with a very attractive climbing rose.
Yes, it's a wonder, isn't it? Subject of a family dispute as well, Stefan. Jane said she wanted a rose there. I said it wouldn't work. Went out one day, came back and found she'd planted it 20 years ago. She was right, wasn't she?
It's done very well, hasn't it?
Oh, it's a magnificent rose. Such a scent, such a shape. It flowers right through under the eaves here until the winter. It gives us real joy. And, you know, she wins prizes with this rose year in, year out at the village flower show.
There's just one thing I have to say, though, Paddy. Is it really the right colour for you?
Look, Jane chose the colour, not me. But seriously, I mean, we had this colour long before they did. In fact, it does seem to be pretty remarkable that the Labour Party actually used this rose as the model for theirs. You see, they can't do anything that's original. They've got to borrow it all from us.
We better go inside.
This is our home. We've been in this home longer than I've been in politics. People sometimes come here and say, MP, God, you don't live in a very big house. Or Party leader, even more so. Won't you move house? And the answer is no. This is where we've come, this is where we've settled, this is where we have our roots down, and this is where we will stay. And for Janie, of course, it's almost back home to where she was brought up.
I was born 30 miles away. My family have lived here for generations, so I'm not going to be moved under any circumstances.
This is our piece of earth. We put into it a lot, and as you see, when you go around it, it rewards us every year.
The appealing thing about iris flowers is that everything comes in threes. You get 3 falls, 3 standards, and even 3 stamens on each flower. And then if you cut the seed capsules in half, you'll see that they're divided into 3, and those maturing seeds will also be triangular. Well, this triple arrangement is common to all iris flowers, but when you consider that there are literally thousands of different varieties and species in cultivation, then the number of different shapes and sizes and colours of flowers is really almost infinite. It's a versatile genus, and the chances are there's an iris to suit every habitat in your garden, from tiny rock garden plants to irises which enjoy life in a dry, sunny border and can blend in with your colour scheme there. And then in a more shady border where the soil's a bit richer and deeper, you can grow the Sibirica hybrids. And even in water, varieties like this make wonderful marginal plants for the water garden. But the sad thing about irises is that the blooms are so short-lived. At best, ones like this only last a day or two, and then they're gone. But having said that, if you plan your gardening carefully, you can have irises in bloom from the depths of winter with the reticulatas and the Danfordiis right through to the middle of summer. And even then, when the blooms are gone, irises often have superb foliage and can make a marvellous architectural statement in a border. But at this time of year, the flowering season comes to a climax with the tall, bearded irises. And in his Nottinghamshire garden, Brian Dodsworth breeds them by the thousand. Well, Brian, you've got a marvellous display here. How do you go about breeding these things?
You simply transfer the pollen from the iris you selected as a pollen parent to the stigma of the iris you selected as a pod parent, and in due course you'll get a pod if the cross takes. And you then harvest the seed, and we, in fact, refrigerate it throughout the winter because it helps the germination process. And if all goes well, we get germination inside the fridge in about 3 months' time. The ones we're looking at now are, in fact, in their 3rd year and final year. They were planted 3 years ago, and they'll be weeded out this year, and perhaps 5% will be retained for growing on, and the rest will be discarded.
What actually makes a good garden iris?
Well, we're looking at one now. This has been out for 4 days, and there's been some appalling weather here, and it's still retained its shape, and the reason for that is the substance in the petal. You feel how thick they are.
It's quite firm.
That's very firm. As a result of that, of course, it will hold, keep its shape.
What about the stems all down
Well,
here?
the other factor is that the stem is what we call branched, so that the flowers, in fact, are held well away from one another and well away from the stem, so that you can see each of them individually. Whereas if you look at this one, it lacks entirely the substance that we were looking at in the one before, the result of which is that the petals are floppy, and in any sort of wind or rain, the shape of the flower is completely destroyed. Again, if you look at this one, for example, you will see that the buds are very tight to the stem, so that when they wish to open, there won't in fact be room for them to do so, and they'll be compressed, and they'll never in fact attain their full form at all.
Well, there are lots of buds to come. This must be a very exciting time for you.
I think it is. It's the highlight of the season, really, for any breeder, because the irises normally do most of their opening in the very early hours of the morning. So you go to bed at night and you can see a bud that is obviously going to open the following day, and you can't wait to see it. So you're up at 4:30 to see what's happened. Very exciting indeed.
There seem to be specific sort of patterns and types. Are they classified into groups?
They are, broadly speaking, yes. There are quite a number. Perhaps the principal among them is the self, which has got what uniform colour. The standards and the falls are the same colour. There are the pliccatas, where you get a stitching pattern around the fringe of all the petals. And there are the aminas, where you get the standards, which are white, and the falls of a variety of colours. They're the principal ones. There are a number of other minor categorisations as well, but those are the main ones.
And as for colour, they seem to come in practically every colour of the rainbow.
That's right. We don't have pillar box red yet, but everything else.
Yes. And Iris, goddess of the rainbows, it's perhaps an apt name for such a lovely plant.
I don't think it could be better.
What about pests and diseases?
Well, fortunately, it's a very minor problem. The only pests we worry about are slugs, and they respond to the normal slug control. Diseases, perhaps the principal one, is bacterial soft rot, which tends to rot the rhizome if you get a particularly wet and clammy spring. The only remedy is to cut away the infected part with a knife, and the rhizome, in fact, will grow away happily after you've done that. The other two problems are scorch and virus. Neither of them are susceptible to any remedy, and the only solution is to live with it as long as you can. And when you find it too objectionable, you have to lift and burn.
What about propagating? How do you keep your irises going on?
Normally speaking, one would lift an iris clump every 3 or 4 years. If you don't, it becomes congested. The rhizomes tend to crawl all over each other, and in this case here, this plant has probably been in position for 5 or 6 years, and as you can see, there is very little flower.
The flowers all around the outside?
All around the outside and blank in the middle, so that is overdue for lifting. By far the best time to lift and replant bearded irises is some 6 weeks or so after they've finished flowering. Obviously, in this case, we're dealing with a standard dwarf iris, which flowers several weeks ahead of the standard tall beardeds.
Even so, it's still early enough, isn't it? It hasn't quite developed very long.
The roots should be at least twice the length that they are at the moment.
Because those are the old
These are the old roots from last year, but they serve as quite adequate anchorage.
Oh, right.
So we divide the outside pieces, take off the old expired fan, and you wouldn't plant a piece as large as that. I personally will split it up the middle like that and make 2 of it. And then you make your hole, leaving a mound in the middle with the tip of the mound on the same level as the surrounding surface. You trim the leaves. This serves 2 purposes. It reduces the moisture loss, and also, of course, it prevents windrock until the roots, in fact, get firmly established. So you deploy the roots around the whole concha. The surface of the rhizome should be exposed to the sun to ensure ripening for flower the following year. One has one's idea of what constitutes a perfect iris, and I think undoubtedly, bit by bit, one gets nearer to it.
The herbs look nice at this time of the year, don't they? And here in the Elizabethan vegetable garden, I like to try and be self-sufficient. But of course, that means self-sufficient in materials too, so I make all my own compost for the deep beds. I've got a couple of homemade compost bins here, and the material comes from the main garden. There's quite a lot of grass cuttings in this lot, so in order to keep the heap well aerated, I like to mix in some fresh strawy horse manure too. But you can see here and there that it's getting a little bit compacted and airless here. So now's the time to turn the heap. And that means throwing the stuff out of the bin, and throw it back in again. Just fluffing it up a little bit as you go to get lots more air into it. And then that'll rot down to a really nice, brown, crumbly, sweet-smelling compost. Now that will be chock-a-block full of natural goodness and will do your soil no end of good. And last week we had a chance to prove it. You may remember that 18 months ago we visited a number of gardens in North Wales that had been devastated by floods of seawater. The soil was absolutely dead. So we recommended that they should use lots of organic matter in the soil, manure and compost, and not plant anything except those plants that will survive in salty conditions until the worms returned, because they're a good sign that life has returned to the soil. Well, last week we went back to see how Terry McNellis had got on.
I love the garden, I really do. I'm quite obsessive about it. And when the floods came, I thought it would be years and years before it would recover. And look at it now. Carnations, geraniums, poppies, you name it, I've got it. I just can't believe it. Most of the plants died. The roses we dug up, washed the roots and potted them. We put most of the plants back late on last year. In fact, the fuchsia was about 18 inches high when we put it in, and it's grown like Jack's beans. It's just so beautiful. I can't believe it. I wouldn't have believed it possible. And the secret? Masses and masses of manure. Lots of hard work, and I've got to admit it, Jeff, you.
So how's that for a natural miracle then? Marvellous, eh? Well, next week, Stefan visits a garden in Somerset that's the result of the legendary Victorian partnership between Lutyens and Jekyll. Nigel will be continuing with his creative planting, showing how you can almost let the plants do the work for you. And I'll be finding out all about butterflies, how you can attract them onto your plot, how you can look after them, and even how you can breed them. And of course, I'll be keeping you up to date with what you should be doing in your garden. Goodbye.